Wait, here.
In times of war, we think that the people that we need to prioritize are innocent lives that were forced into a circumstance where human rights violations are occurring, and we think that under those circumstances, those are the people that we need to prioritize, not the journalists who considered and willingly went against or rather crossed the border of enemy lines. We think that those kinds of lives, yes, sadly we agree that we will lose 1 or 2 lives, but we think that the general purview of wanting to peacekeep and eventually bringing down a regime is something that we should prioritize beyond. 2 questions need to be answered in today's debate. First, I'll analyze to you why there is a finite capacity when it comes to peacekeeping forces and how they need to prioritize their capacity and their ability on individuals that are innocent to begin with and were forced into a circumstance where their rights were violated. And secondly, I analyze, or rather I'll draw a comparison to you, the lives of journalists, or rather the value of the people on the ground, and I'll explain to you eventually why the journalist is someone that we should forego at the end of the day. But let's deal with some preparation. Number 1, when we talk about obligated, it basically means that it's an obligation, it's mandatory, meaning peacekeepers now have an active duty to get themselves involved, cross enemy borders in order to save journalists. We don't think that that's something necessary, rather we think that it was something that could have been avoided. Second characterization, we think that when it comes to peacekeeping forces, they are basically protectors who are sent into countries to protect people who are forced into circumstances where there are human rights violations. We think that those are innocent people that the peacekeepers went there to protect, not journalists. No, thank you. Moving on to the characterization, we think that when it comes to war correspondents, it's basically journalists, right? Because we think that number 1, these journalists knew the consequences of going in, or rather crossing enemy bases, and also they considered to those consequences in which they decided to cross those enemy lines. But more importantly, is information from that particular journalist necessary? We don't think so, because governments always have their own means of gathering information. Even so, I think that there isn't a need for war correspondents to eventually cross enemy lines to gather those kinds of information. What are enemy lines? No thank you. We think that enemy lines? No thank you. We think that enemy lines are basically enemy boundaries where you shouldn't cross, where it's an area where it's controlled by an enemy and so on. So under those circumstances, we think that those are boundaries that individuals should never cross to begin with. Moving on to the first question on finite capacity of peacekeepers, and what am I trying to show through this argument is that we think that just because there is a finite capacity in these circumstances, we think that eventually these peacekeepers should prioritize, or rather maximize their very potential on individuals that can save, eventually bringing down their regime and forming peace, right? We think that those kind of individuals, or rather those kind of issues are what we should prioritize at the end of the day. Before moving on any further, yes?
So when corporations force their journalists to go into times of war based on the capacity or pay, would you then also consider them victims of social circumstances or innocent people?
Look, number 1, corporations don't force you to go into cross enemy lines. They force you to go into the battleground, but they tell you to stay in the safe zone. They don't tell you to go across enemy lines. But even so, even though corporations were to force you, you have always the option to opt out. We don't see how the idea of forcing is necessarily absolute. I've already accepted one, no more. Moving on to the first question. First analysis of the first question. Why is it then a mandate for peacekeepers to then protect these individuals, or rather these journalists? We don't think so. Number 1, we think that their mandate was always to protect innocent people, or pull these innocent people out of those situations where they are forced into, where they are being abused, where they are being oppressed, where they are being tortured in this circumstance. Those are the people that we need to prioritize. Those are the people that were innocent to begin with and weren't given the consent to be in those situations in itself. In comparison to journalists, we think that journalists are the ones that consented to go in that particular war zone, number 1. But more often than not, corporations or governments don't push journalists into a corner where they have to cross enemy lines. We don't think that that's necessarily the case. We think that whenever it comes to crossing enemy lines, it's a sole voluntary decision. Under that circumstance, we don't think that we should then risk a soldier's life to then save a particular journalist just because of its uninformed consent in these circumstances. Because we think that the life of soldiers are equally as valuable as this journalist in itself. We don't think that we should forego or rather risk the lives of these soldiers. More importantly, why is it problematic? Should we allow this mandate to cross, or rather should we force force soldiers to be obliged to protect journalists. We think that you allow soldiers to then sidetrack their prioritization because now they will be distorted or rather affected or influenced by the idea that journalists, we do have to protect the journalists. You distort the very mechanisms of how they should go about this war in itself. You affect the very process in itself because you allow soldiers to then sidetrack, prioritizing more than they can actually prioritize. It affects their very capacity in itself. I said no more. Also, you halt the very peacekeeping methods because all kinds of process when it comes to protecting the people, protecting innocent people that were forced into these circumstances will now be diluted because they need to protect journalists as well. Journalists who voluntarily went into those circumstances, and we don't think that is particularly fair. Which brings me to the second question, within the comparison of journalists and people on the ground. This argument is to show you why journalists don't necessarily value their life as much as people on the ground and how it's much fairer and much more important to prioritize people on the ground. People who necessarily were forced into that circumstances just because they were so happened to be born in the area, but not necessarily because they wanted to enter those areas. Number one, why is it that journalists is someone that we do not prioritize as much as people on the ground? Because we think that journalists, number one, they were informed of what's happening in those circumstances. They knew the consequences of going in. They knew it's risking their life, and yet they choose to go in. It means to say that they conceded that to all the harm that can possibly happen to them. More importantly, they decided to cross enemy lines. They could have just, if information was what they want, they could have just stayed beyond the safe zone and not cross enemy lines. The problem with them crossing enemy lines is but basically showing us that they conceded to the very harms or rather the consequences of wanting to cross those kinds of enemy lines, and they know how bad these enemies can be, and they know that eventually they will put themselves into harm. Understanding these circumstances where the journalists don't necessarily value their life as much, we think that why is it then problematic to risk soldiers into those kinds of circumstances? Because number one, is it then fair for the soldiers to be obligated to then save someone who never really cared about himself to begin with? We think no, because soldiers are there to protect the people that were forced into those circumstances. We think that those are the people that we need to prioritize, and soldiers shouldn't risk their lives or even get harmed because these individuals decided to cross enemy lines, because we think that enemy lines, should soldiers really cross enemy lines, it's far detrimental towards the soldiers in itself. But more importantly, is this information necessary to begin with? We don't think so, because being in the war zone itself provides you enough information, sufficient information to cater to the public who wants to know the kind of information. Why is there then a need to cross enemy lines? We don't see that dire necessity. We think that staying on the safe zone itself is already a good enough avenue to gain those kind of information. But more importantly, we think that the very nature of journalism in itself is that they are profit-driven, in which they always go for the juiciest, they always have the mentality of going for the juiciest information. Here, all you want, that's the mentality of journalists. We think that the problem then becomes them not being informed in those decision-making processes where they are not able to understand the consequences in those kind of circumstances. And we think that that is why we need to stop this form of obligation of protecting them in order to send out the message and deter them from ever wanting to cross enemy lines. Tell them that it's wrong to do so. Our angles are simple. We think that yes, sadly we have to agree that lives will be lost. But understanding to weigh out the more prioritized issue is to save or rather to pull those innocent people out of those kind of situations of human rights violation. We think that information is something that we are willing to forego. We think that the lives of journalists are something that we are willing to forego to save or rather to garner the greater good. Thank you.
Right, thanks speaker for your speech. We now invite the first speaker from opposition, the leader of opposition.
The Geneva Convention states that any humanitarian worker or any peacekeeper has an obligation to protect individuals within capacity. We think that these individuals have capabilities that we think were severely mischaracterized by side opposition. One point rebuttal before I move on to the case. Do peacekeepers have a capacity to do so and save all these individuals? Three responses. Number one, we think peacekeepers, or often the body, or the UN peacekeepers, or the UN, often has a multitude amount of individuals who be part of this mission to begin with. For example, in Rwanda, where they had more children that require saving, they pumped in more peacekeepers into their country to save more children with that capacity. That means the United Nations has the capacity to do so, it's just whether or not they want to send it out. We think that capacity is not a problem. But second response is that whether or not there is actually a safe zone. Because corporations are very competitive to begin with. It's about jobs. So when it comes to this circumstance, you know that if I stay in that safe zone and don't garner any information to begin with, I will lose my job. I will go back hungry. I will not be able to eat for the rest of the day, and I will die. We think these are the kinds of Hobson's choice that exist within this status quo. We need to protect them because they are victims themselves within these circumstances. We think it's only fair. The last question that we have is, can you really get information behind the safe zone? The speaker, it's called a safe zone for a reason. There is no information that no one actually obtains. These are the kinds of things we have to understand. If you don't have information within the safe zone, what is your purpose there? he knows that when I go back to the corporation without any new material, I will get fired. And if I have a disincentive to do so, that is not a thing. But even if they do consent, they're going to engage with their case to do so, I'll tell you why they're similar to old people or children where you have to save them out of these conflict zones, similar to the case. Before I move on, yeah, because they're hacking. Right, sure, why not? Like, first question, right? Why this policy harms the right to information? Because we tell you that it harms journalists to begin with. Why will these individuals not harming these people harm the journalists? Why? Because A, these journalists don't have weapons, they don't have the capacity to defend themselves within these circumstances. And B, the explicit function is to not be part of that war. The only function they have is to report the sightings, to report the issues. Why is providing information not part or entering that war? Because the state recognizes and understands that you as an individual don't intend to be a part of the war, you don't intend to be a combatant, and you don't intend to fight the war to a particular side. You're only there for the information, we think that's only fair. That's the reason why you can't shoot soldiers in the battlefield, because we recognize that they aren't combatants. If they aren't combatants and they're innocent civilians, we think that we have a right to protect them and to protect the vulnerable. Secondly, we think that journalists are of a job that's of extreme danger, and we need these individuals a lot. Because the power that these journalists do is that they provide information during times of conflict, something that we need a lot for right to information and stuff like that. We think that we depend a lot on these individuals, and the problem with status quo is that a lot of people are not willing to become journalists to the status quo because they fear the trouble that they have to go through, they fear the danger that we have within these conflict zones. Extending protection to these individuals will then incentivize more of journalists to come into this power, more information to be excreted in a recognized member of society. We think when soldiers have the capacity to do so, we think it's only fair. Because how these UN peacekeepers work is that they estimate the number of soldiers that you need for that particular mission. If you see that there are more journalists entering, you just send a larger group of combatants into the area, thus you have the capacity and you have the ability to do so. The third level of analysis, we want to compensate because there are a portion of individuals who are coerced into becoming journalists or they're coerced into being part of this mission to begin with. Two parts. Because what happens in cooperations? You opt in for the journalist part, or you opt in for the journalist job, but you don't necessarily opt in to be a part of that war. So if the boss tells you to go to that war, you have no choice but to follow that boss or get fired to begin with. There's a kind of Hobson's choice that exists in these circumstances, something that we want to recognize. But secondly, do they consent? No. Why? Because you have to do your job. But even if they do consent to a certain extent, even if they want to get this information, it is a Hobson's choice. How do we best maximize these individuals who are vulnerable, who are victims of these circumstances? We think that these individuals don't have real decisions and they don't have the real capacity to not make that decision. They have to do so because they need the money, they need to survive, and they need to live. We think that in these circumstances, you have to protect them. But what about prolonging the war? Because the nature of this information is very simple. That these individuals or journalists have the capacity when it comes to providing this information to the news corporation, they have the capacity to put in their own opinions, right? Although it's not very explicit, it is pretty implicit within these circumstances. What happens under their paradigm? When you don't protect these journalists, when you explicitly tell these individuals that you are not going to be protected, I'm not going to help you, in these circumstances, journalists get angry, we think something, we don't want to do so. Because what happens is, you prolong the war. You tell individuals that you make the stories straight when it comes to corporations like this. We think in these circumstances dangerous. Because when it comes to ending the war, we need something that is consensual. Before that, yes.
Look, so you're characterizing to me how the UN has such a vast capacity to protect these people. But yet again, you're telling me no, we need to depend on journalists to gather information. If you're telling me that the UN is so capable, why do you need to depend on journalists for information?
Because the UN doesn't send people to get information, the UN sends people to protect other combatants. The function is different. The amount of peacekeepers that UN have is a lot. If you have more journalists coming in and you allow journalists to come in because you're going to protect them, you can roughly estimate the amount of peacekeepers you need for that particular mission. I don't even understand that idea. But secondly, on the second argument, on why war and how this dilutes the purpose of war. Because war always has principle and goals, and we still have some humanitarian values even though when war breaks out. For example, when you had the Geneva Convention, when we still go and get the Nazis back after all these years, although they have still committed so much crimes. Why is this important? Because we want individuals to fight more just wars when it comes to wars in these circumstances. We think it's important because some humanity must exist. Why? Because when you dilute the current principles of war that exist within status quo, this is necessarily harmful. Because what exactly happens? Because the principle of what exists in status quo to peacekeepers is that you must help the weak, you must help the defenseless, you must help the unarmed. In these circumstances, journalists fit perfectly into these criteria where they are weak, they are defenseless, they don't intend to be part of that war, and they are unarmed. In these circumstances, you must protect the journalists because they have no intention to be a part of the war rather than just getting information to do so. Especially when these individuals have the capacity to do so, we don't see a reason as to why they can't. What happens in their paradigm? When you value the current principles as to what war can do, when you contribute to the very idea that you don't really have to help some individuals who are, not who are vulnerable in these circumstances, what happens? Because you think that when you set a precedence on the current principles of war, these are necessarily harmful. Because you set a precedence that all other Geneva Convention laws or all other principles are necessarily flippy, and you don't really have to be followed because we can just flip them whenever we want. This is what happens in these circumstances, and we are contradicting the very idea that you don't have to help a vulnerable individual. You can't bomb religious places, you can't kill children in war. These are the kinds of things that we already have in the status quo. Your side will contradict to do so. When you have the capacity to do so, when you have the army, when you can estimate the number of individuals to help these individuals and garner better information for the world, we don't see a reason as to why not.
Right, thanks speaker for your speech. You now invite the second speaker from the government team, the Prime Minister.
The debate was not about how many peacekeeping forces we can send. The debate is not about adding on the military operations on the ground so that we are able to specifically protect journalists at the end of the day, as what Roshan said, was a counter model to our solution. We don't think that was the debate, what the debate was about. Sean explicitly came and told you, the debate was, is the life of the particular journalist or the situation that the journalist put himself in, was it number one avoidable, or number two, was there an option for him to opt out of the particular scenario at the end of the day? But the conclusion to this particular issue, or what this debate really was about, is that is the life of those peacekeeping forces something that we are willing to risk at the end of the day for the value of life of the particular journalist. Side opposition told us two things as to why the value of the journalist, value of life of the journalist is equivalent to any other civilian out there. Number one, they came and told us because the journalist was choiceless in his options in going that particular area. He had no options of opting out as the company forced him. Second reason is he came and told him was that the necessity for the particular information coerced him into being at the spot as he was his duty. There are two issues of the debatters that I will talk to you about today. Number one, is it really something that's compulsory for journalists to actually be there, or was there any option of opting out? And two, what is the option, or what is the importance of the information that's been given by the journalist at the end of the day? First, let's look at the nature of this information that's provided by the journalist. They give it to us that because the journalist or the field of journalism itself is extremely competitive, therefore journalists are very stuck with their job requirements and therefore would have to follow whatever their companies tell them. We don't think that Roshan gave any justice to the job scope as a whole, because it's always an opting out whenever it comes to any job or you're always able to opt out for a particular company and move to another company that suits your own demand. We don't think that every company will force every one of the journalists to go down into the battlefield and cross enemy borders into enemy control lines and risking their own lives at the end of the day. We don't think it's fair for us to debate on the grounds that's absolute in that sense. But number two, even if such a circumstance were to occur in Germany, we don't think that's fair. We don't think the companies have the authority or the ability to force individuals or to coerce them into risking their own lives in Germany. You can sue the corporation if they force you into such a situation. We are going to be actively risking your own lives at the end of the day. We think there are measures to protect journalists in this sense. Why do we need to take into Roshan? Why do we need to acknowledge what Roshan properly came and told you? But secondly, this whole issue of the importance of the information that's provided by the journalists. Roshan came to paint you a picture that journalists are the only people on the ground that are capable of providing information as to what happens in warfare. But we already told you through Sean how there are other mitigating factors or other alternatives that avoid such problems. Number one, you can always take forms of information beyond or without crossing enemy lines. You can stay within safe houses, you can stay within safeguards or military peacekeeping force bases and not cross over into enemy lines. The same way journalists today who cross over to Syrian borders when there are no peacekeeping forces there and then risk their own lives there. We don't think that is something that's necessary. But number two, if information is something that you really want, there are other forms of information. Governments have their own forms of intelligence operations which are able to publish themselves. We don't think that journalists have to use this for information as something as a reason why you're going to risk the life of journalists on your day. The approach to this issue is extremely simple. Number one, Sean has really told you alternatives to the problem. Number two, if you want to tell me the importance of the information is so dire, then why do we need individuals who are incapable of protecting themselves to go down into the warfare and get information a day? We think we can use it to protecting or government intelligence means to tell the public what really is happening on the ground. But lastly, no sit down. Roshan even told us this entire issue about reducing the threshold of war. Because we don't save journalists and journalists die in a day, we are reducing the importance of Geneva Conventions or any other conventions or treaties that uphold the sanctity of life. But number one, we have to analyze what really is the importance of these treaties. This treaty was about reducing the amount of loss of lives in warfare. The reason why we have the Geneva Convention is to reduce the amount of loss of life. We don't target paramedics, we don't target women, we don't target children. We want to reduce the job scopes to individuals who are directly involved or direct combatants in warfare. The conclusion today is the rhetoric that this convention is trying to send is that we do not want you to get involved in warfare unless you really need to, or you really need it to get involved in a particular active service. What it inherently means is that there are no forms of other alternatives that were put into place by the journalists and your team. But the conclusion to that, ladies and gentlemen, is if you really analyze the journalist itself. The journalist had the option. He consensually crossed enemy borders. The same way the journalists who went to Syria today got caught and got killed. Those examples are examples of journalists consensually going over and crossing over the enemy lines and then were caught and killed. We don't think that something is upholding Geneva Convention, especially when now soldiers have to risk their own lives to save individuals who themselves have no regard for their own personal safety. Yes, Roshan.
People are always coerced by materialistic things. Although you want to call it a practical consent, they have really no choice but to do so, or else they will get fired and they don't have the capacity to live. Why must you not protect them when in your principle you must protect the weak and vulnerable?
Number one, it's totally impractical. How can you tell me that a journalist company can force a journalist to go and risk his own bloody life and kill himself literally behind enemy lines in his German? Because if you tell me a journalist does not have any option of opting out to go to a different country, if you feel that BBC is forcing you to go down into the enemy lines of Syria, then switch to CNN. If CNN itself is forcing you to do so, switch to Reuters. We think there are plenty of opportunities that exist. We think a job market will always be able to cater to individuals wherever there is a demand. We think Roshan is debating absolutely, we don't think we got to take that into consideration. But let's look at the duty of soldier and the value of life of a soldier, which is my green matter. What am I going to talk to you about? I'm going to talk to you about how allowing this policy is going to reduce the value of life of a soldier. It's going to tell us today that the soldier can do anything or should sacrifice his life for any single goddamn person on the warfare, and how that is something that's not good in the value of life for the name of the soldier. What really are we fine with in terms of the duty of soldier today? We think the soldier should only be responsible for the lives of individuals who are forced in such circumstance. We're talking about in comparative analysis to people living under the ruthless regime of a violent dictator, people who cannot go out of their houses unless being bombed by shells, people who live in West Bank, people who live in Gaza, people in these areas whose lives are a continuous torture because circumstances that are beyond their control. What is the conclusion to this, or what is the conclusion to the duty of soldier and everything? The duty of soldier, or the act of the soldier risking his own life, should only be absolutely necessary in protecting a defenseless and innocent person in a day who had no option whatsoever of getting out of the particular scenario. And why is it only important that we restrict it to that particular scenario? Because the soldier is also a human. The soldiers also have important value of life. If you want to tell me you're going to risk the value of peacekeeping forces on the ground because of someone who had the option of opting out, who had the option of not being there in the first place, or something that is not really important and could be done through other alternatives, then why are you doing so as such? If you tell me that the peacekeeping forces are a slave to the lives of everyone else, and their lives are then able to subservient to the lives of everyone else, we don't think that is something that's good, because these people too deserve a value of life every day. Inherently, it's never to ask yourself the question: do you want to listen to some opposition that tells you that journalists have no option in opting out whatsoever because we think that's the only justification that tells us why we should save their lives? We don't think that is true under their sense. Thank you.
The same way humanitarian workers help people who are defenseless within a war zone, people or soldiers who also consented to a war, who can't protect themselves, we don't attack them, we don't shoot them. If not, we do protect them even if they're behind enemy lines. We need to extend this right, or we need to make it an obligation if we're fighting a status quo, because we need to understand that we're going to prove to you how these people never had any form of implicit consent. I'm going to integrate all my responses within my 2 questions which I'm going to ask today's debate. Firstly, should we forward this information? Is it really consent? Can you really opt out of this job? Can you necessarily go for another job within this small circuit or this small scope in times of war? Secondly, is it what should be yardstick as to how protection? Is it really the value of a life soldier is solely based on innocence, or is it based on who can be defenseless, irregardless based on history, based on past? We need to look at the point in time now. But firstly, should we follow information? Because they try to tell us that the lack of capacity by peacekeepers. Firstly, no, because these journalists decrease the burden of peacekeepers. I'm going to prove it to you now. How? Because in times of war, information is more important. Because some people within their country don't know that they're within war. Some people are unaware of circumstances like this. Why is this important? Because they inform other victims and gain support for what is naturally immaterialistic. Why is this necessary a big thing in today's debate, right? Because at the end of the day, the information is something that most people react to in positive forms of material. Why are your people taking so much burden, or why is there so many peacekeepers being forced to take care of people? Because people don't want to cooperate with peacekeepers within most case scenarios like this, right? People don't understand, or don't have any form of initiative to cooperate. Because people think that peacekeepers are neglecting or being neglecting in circumstances like this. No, thank you. Because under their paradigm, how do they increase the burden of peacekeepers? Because if they were to argue that we should forego one or two lives, we should forego lives, then we had some form of opportunity or we had some form of chance of risking. How do the people react to it? People under the care of peacekeepers? Would you have to allocate more peacekeepers who are trying to protect these people? People who are benevolent, people who thought peacekeepers were neglecting to journalists with circumstances like this. If your argument was there's a lack of capacity under your paradigm, you'll even be more stunted under their paradigm, right? Because corporations will strengthen this logic. The media has that much influence into putting and increasing that form of propaganda that peacekeepers and these forms of protectors already abandoned all the journalists. So I move on to my second level analysis. Sure.
Peacekeeping forces have drones, have satellites, have surveillance mechanisms that far outweigh the importance of journalists. If you want an alternative, why don't you have intelligence reports publishing situations on the ground?
Okay, let me just take on the alternative, because they try to understand governments can get information from other forms of sources. Sure, you have your drones, sure, you have live operations, but will governments reveal it to the public? What's the problem with that, right? Under times of war, will governments take that form of initiative, or will governments really take the risk of releasing these forms of reports into the public? What's the because at the end of the day, it makes it harder, because they won't tell the public. In times of war, they need to be discreet about what they necessarily do in order to make sure that their plan doesn't necessarily backfire. That's why in times of war, we don't reveal all forms of information towards the public. So they rely on governmental forms of information. It won't necessarily work at the end of the day, Speaker. No, thank you. They create benevolence within people, because people don't understand what the peacekeepers are doing is in the name of protecting the majority. People will be more benevolent under their paradigm. People are most likely to respond in larger forms of ways, which also increases the burden of peacekeepers. If they want to protect peacekeepers, or they want to increase the kind of capacity, they're not necessarily doing that. But then they try to tell us that peacekeepers or journalists are not necessarily forced. Because they said you can opt out. Sure, because if you were to be opt out, you'd have to go to another job scope. A job scope that's already minimized by the capacity of war. A job scope that's already severely minimized because you're in war within these kinds of scenarios, Mr. Speaker. It's harder for you to find a job because people are already lining up to find jobs. People are already queuing up within these kinds of areas. So if you opt out, let's say you're out on the street within circumstances like this. People always prioritize their own capacity and trying to make money for their families. They can't do that if your only alternative is for them to leave their form of profession, if they can do something by providing for the people. But then they say, no, it's not compulsory, because you can always do things like suing media corporations, you can always do things like opting out. The problem with suing media corporations, the problem with suing any corporation in any point of time. They have lawyers, they have capacity, more than any other person does. We don't want to take that risk. You're only losing your money because they have the kind of capability up to the point where they have falsified information. But then, no, thank you. Actually, yeah, sure.
Are you trying to tell me that the ability of governments to sue corporations who actively put their journalists into trouble or risk their own lives is impossible under your model?
So not only are you fighting a war and trying to win that war, you want to allocate time and try suing corporations in circumstances like this. Who are you trying to protect under these paradigms? Under their case, or even in a materialistic case, governments always pay full forms of attention towards war. Humanity sometimes goes on the window. But the second question is innocence always a yardstick to protection? Because they try to tell us the value of a soldier is only based on how contingent or what they were finding. They try to extend this to the duty of soldier, how to only protect the defenseless, individuals who are innocent, people who can't necessarily protect themselves. And they also extended these yardsticks to people who opted into this scenario, people who knew that it was avoidable. First response, we've already proven to you how these people weren't necessarily aware. The same way when some people opt into war, your ship shipped into another battlefield without being informed of full forms of consequences. These are people who are already profit-minded, who are trying to spread forms of information towards other individuals. So you say journalists are selfish, they're people who are trying to garner support information for the rest of the community to understand. The same way protect humanitarian workers is the same way we're going to try to protect these people. But then they try to say we're going to reduce these yardsticks. Because the importance of treaties under their paradigm is to reduce the level of casualties, is to reduce the amount of people that die within war. Time's up. Is to reduce the amount of people that die within war. Sure, that's why we're extending this right towards journalists, people who can't protect themselves within war, people who don't have the capacity to bring guns or bring weapons with them towards the enemy lines. We think it's important to allocate some form of duties of peacekeepers towards these individuals because these are people who are defenseless. We've proven to you how information is necessarily important. If they can't give us an alternative, or their only alternative is governments necessarily doing the reports for them, governments who have big, larger responsibilities, they reveal the information towards the people, which could also be used by enemy forces, which could also be used by people who are staying within your grounds and taking your information. So if they have no other forms of yardsticks, they have no other forms of alternatives, in itself, journalists are priceless. We need to protect these individuals. We think that it's important to recognize that a valued soldier extends to how much you can do. If you can protect the journalists, you should necessarily do that. Otherwise, you'll already be punished under status quo. We need to protect people who can't protect themselves. If that's something that they can't do, there's nothing the government should stand for.
Right, thanks speaker for his speech. We now invite the third speaker from the government team. Yes.
Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, how could you not know that going to Syria at a time like this especially, every day you see on the news that there are people dying out there and it's not a safe place to be as a whole. We think that there are some logical progressions that they never got in their whole case over there, and we don't think it was very fair for us to argue within their grounds and what was not realistic in that sense. Two issues I have for today. Number one, our government is generally dependent on journalists, and number two, is there a general necessity to spread this info to the general public, and what is the dire need to do it, which they haven't proven. I'll show you why, right? Before that, some petty rebuttals, right? Some things we have to explain or re-characterize in that sense, if you want to really put it like that, is that generally job scopes are really wide. We never saw that problem in this sense when they start telling you that there's no other job in the world if you were to quit going to Syria, there's no other job in the world that you're going to get fired for sure if you're going to actually, not go to Syria in that sense. So we don't think that is generally fair for them. We generally also did not want to, believe that sense. When they talk to you about the media and how they were that evil in a way that they would, they would fire you on the spot, they would push you into places like that, knowing that there's no form of security at all, and we don't think that is generally true, right? We think that what his predication on is that how media or how these companies were generally money-minded in that sense. And what we do to actually counteract that problem is to negate this idea of money-mindedness, and we take away this stereotype about how this institutions work on money-based wants and incentives rather than selfish life of people in that sense. First issue, our government is generally dependent on these journalists. Yes, I talked to you and told you yes, generally because there's no other form of info, there's no other way we can get info in that sense. But we generally did not think this was true, because we have all sorts of intel and things like that. We think that the government or the militia or the military terms get their information on their own, and there's no actually real necessity in that way to spread it out in the general public, which is what my second issue will be about. But generally, how did they lose out on this issue? When they're talking about the idea of capacity and how they wanted to maximize the potential just because they had it in a sense, we don't think it was very relevant in this sense. Why? We questioned, so what? There was no necessity, and Sean told you from the beginning of the speech that it wasn't dire that we give this information to the public in that sense. And number two, we told you that we push the mentality that money incentive is worth risking lives in a sense if we're going to go via case. Because what they try to promote is this: hey, you're not going to get your money, or no one is going to get their money if you don't get the hot topic of what's going on in Syria's most torturous camp and that sort of thing. So we don't think it was fair in that way to put this burden on these new people, or these journalists in that sense, and we don't think that this characterization was actually true. Why? Because of this. Because when they talk to you about the idea of fearing danger in the sense about how these peacekeepers, these journalists want safer jobs in that sense, because there's no guarantee of who's going to protect them or whatnot. We think that this wasn't true as well. Why? Because there's no guarantee anyway, number one, with your peacekeepers over there. Fine, they make it a little bit safer, but there's no guarantee in that sense. But number two, we also told you that there's no dire necessity, because you can get your information or whatever you want from the general war field itself, or war zone, whatever news as a whole. We don't think you really need to go in the kind of like say, hey, this guy's experimenting with gas tags and things like that. We don't think that these are generally important things that the public should know, or even that the public knows. We think there are general repercussions that affect them, and we don't think that's why we're not standing for this motion as well, right? But
Point.
next, before that, yes.
So the media strengthens the information and tells the people that these peacekeepers willingly neglected a journalist and let the journalist die. How will the people react?
We don't think the obligation comes like that, sir. We tell you this, right? When these peacekeepers show the incentive that, hey, we're not going to supply you, we're not going to help you, if you're going to go beyond these lines, we tell you that the characterizations and very clear lines of what is a dangerous zone or not. So we think when it comes to issues like that, or the way that we describe things like that, media companies will now be disincentivized to do these kind of things. Why? Because it's a bloody dangerous place to go to. Obviously, no one want to go there. If your boss decides to be harsh on you in that sense, we give you three alternatives. You can quit, you can sue the fella, you can sue the company, or you can, like these things that people have rights, and we don't think that it's fair for them to actually debate on a caveat of where these people don't have rights at all. Because we think that we uphold the rights of people or the value of life in this sense, rather than risking to get this information to the public, assuming the public needed it as well, right? But next issue, is there a dire necessity to spread this info? They told you yes, and their justification is generally, why not? Just because they needed it. But then later in Kishan's speech, he told you how you can regulate this information now. But we tell you that regulation isn't really a feasible thing to do in this kind of case. Because the media, if your characterization said that the media always wanted the hot topics and things like that, so we don't think that regulation will happen, because they are more likely to flood out whatever secret information they have to the general public, therefore not diminishing, more like letting out the secrets that the militia should know, or the militia deserves to know in the sense. No, thank you. But here's the thing. What did we tell you? We told you that there's no necessity at all to spread this info. But why? We told you very easily that this issue doesn't make sense at all. Why? Because the general public doesn't need to know what kind of ways you're experimenting with people. The government, the public doesn't need to know how exactly you're torturing people in your camps. The government doesn't exactly the public doesn't exactly need to know how many tanks, military armies, troops and things you have. We think that these are up for the military to handle. These are for the government to handle. We think that there's generally no need for it. No, thank you. But we took this. What was this debate generally about? We've proven to you three things: that journalists are generally not forced, or even if they are really forced in their case, they have other alternatives to opt out. Number two, we have shown you that even if there's no option out, I told you this actually, that they have other options, that they can quit, things like that. So here's the thing: what is the general dire need of this? And that's something we have to reflect throughout this whole debate. Because they've told you that the dire need is to keep the public in general noticed or noted about how many people die, as well as what exactly goes on in these military camps and whatnot. Which we told you that this isn't for the public to decide at all, because the public generally, they can't do anything with this information. And number two, we think that this disincentivizes the public to actually give a good name to your enemy in that sense. And that kind of stereotypes the sense, hey, they're doing this, they're probably bad people. And that kind of spreads the message out, incentive out, which is something we don't want to do as a peacekeeping army or peacekeeping unit, right? So we think it was quite very harmful in all these cases. For all these reasons, we took this debate.
Right, thank you very much. We now invite the third speaker from the opposition team, the opposition with. Yeah.
there's one thing that side government didn't understand. The people that the soldiers are accountable to, the same people that the soldiers owe an obligation or duty to, is the same people that the journalists owe a duty to. The people of your nation, the general public that are wanting for your information, that need protection from the government, that need protection from the people that have more capacity, that have more experience, or necessarily have that more capacity to, or capability to garner that information, to give them the form of security and protection that people need. We think if it's in line with the duty of the soldier to protect them, it's in line with the duty of the journalist to give them the information they need to feel protected. Mr. Speaker, there are two issues raised today. First of all, why isn't it justified to neglect the journalists in this circumstance? Secondly, in which paradigm will we construct a higher standard of moral in wars? First of all, why is it not justified to neglect the journalists in this circumstance? The first thing that side government wanted to argue upon is the idea of consent. Have a seat. They wanted to tell you that the problem was they knew that there was a war there, and they knew that Syria was having a war. The first thing I wanted to ask them was how they knew the war was there, because of the journalists that were coexistent. That you say, Mr. Speaker, we tell you that in that case, the government is the one that you will rely upon. The government is the intelligence group that you will rely upon will be biased, will be corrupted in their circumstances, where they will only give you information that is unilateral, will only give you information that is government-sided. We think that's when information is harmed, that's when media is harmed as a whole. Because if media is in the name of having multilateral opinions, if it's in the name of giving people as much as information as you want, as much as opportunities as people want to know about, as more information as people want to know about, why do you limit the capacity for people? Why do you limit the capacity for people to decide which war is the justified one? Which side is the better one? We think this is what will harm the situation. Have a seat. The second level is in which paradigm media or the news will be better of quality. First level is the idea of corporations, because they have more money, they have more experienced journalists. Under your side, you're going to kill these experienced journalists. You're going to kill people that know which form of the news to get for, and which form of that war to tell people about, and not about how many military tanks, how much money you spend in the war, which is all going to be sidelined, because we know that these people have the experience and have that form of exposure. They will die because of the capacity that you don't give them. The second level is that the media groups, because we told you that they owe a duty to the people. If it's not the only avenue, it's a majority of the avenue. It's the avenue of the majority. Because not everyone is going to go to a website of your intelligence group and find out what happened in the war. But even if they find out, they have more trust with the corporations, with BBC, with CNN, with journalists that know what they're doing out there. You want to explain it to them, we're fine. But to get information, if it's a majority's way, if it's the better way of obtaining it, because more journalists can go into war fields, more journalists can go into cross the enemy line, because it's the best way of getting the information. You will get better information if you go into the enemy line. What do you want to get in the safe zone? How many number of soldiers you have? You don't think that's what you need? That's not the form of information you need. You need to know what's actually happening. Since you're so stubborn, yeah. Good job. Second number to this issue, it's a gamble, because they told us it's a gamble anyway. Even if the soldier is, even if this policy is put in place, the soldier is not going to be safe anyway. But what's the delineation? It doesn't mean if this policy exists, the soldier will be safe. Yes, we agree with you, but there is a better chance that journalists will be saved by the soldier. The soldier might, or most probably, will save the journalists in this circumstance if it makes them feel safer than they were under your, and then they will be under your paradigm. If it makes them feel safer, or explore more forms of information, or more forms of news at the end of the day, we think that this is already a justification for them. If you cross the line, and that's when we tell them that you will not protect them, because they told you as long as you stay in the safe zone, where I wonder if there will be any danger. If they told you that if you stay in the safe zone, we will protect you. Why do you need to protect them from? The sunshine, the rainbows? We think that when you cross the enemy line is where the danger exists. That is when we need the soldiers with the guns. That's when we need the soldiers with the capacity to fight that people who might kill that journalist, because he's gaining information on the people that are your enemies at the end of the day. Because just because they're your enemies doesn't mean you will kill them straight away. The second issue, in which paradigm do we uphold morality in wars? The first thing is human rights violation. They told us that human rights violation is the issue in today's debate. Have a seat. They told us why they're different from other people. They wanted to draw a delineation. Why journalists are different from paramedics. Why journalists are different from people like children and women, but still are defenseless. The first thing they want to tell you is who shows the people that the war that you're fighting is justified. Who shows the people that the war, that conflict you're going to is actually worth the gamble because you're taking away the taxpayers' money. If you actually think about it, they make it a more justified war. Why? If you lose the war by saving a child or lose the war by saving a woman and end rape that you have to do in status quo, then the same way you will lose the war if you save that journalist. But if you can win the war by saving millions of children, if you can win the war saving the millions of women, the same way you will win the war by saving that journalist at the end of the day. It's not going to limit your capacity to win as a unit, as a peacekeeping unit. We don't think one soldier saving one journalist is going to make you lose the war. But even if that bullet that is shattered into that soldier is something that is justified because the millions of people know what happened. The millions of people garner that information, or the journalist died by getting information from it. We think that's the principle that exists because we don't think that they will lose by saving a war correspondent. But even if they do, it's within the lines of that duty of that soldier. This nicely leads on to my second level of this issue, the value and the life and the duty of the soldier, because this is what Levin wanted to talk about. He told us that they will only protect the people that are defenseless. They will only protect the people that don't have the capacity, that are not armed in the situation, that are vulnerable in the situation. That's what we told you. Journalists fit right into this criteria because journalists uphold a non-interventionist stance, Mr. Speaker. They are there not to interfere. They are there on a neutral paradigm into providing information, into providing media, for people to interpret how they want to interpret that information that you give them. We think when you disallow for them to maximize their capacity as journalists, you disallow them to function as a duty of the people. If the soldiers have owed a duty to the people, the journalists also owe a duty to the people and owe the duty to the general public that need the information. So why can't the soldiers protect these people that owe a duty to the people? Why can't they protect these individuals that are in line with the principles of the war that you're fighting for? All they want to do was the difference of consenting into going into the war, because that's the relation they drew. They told you if you consented into going into the war, even though you knew there was danger, that's where we won't save you. This is where the harm occurs. We don't think the principle is justified. The same people the obligation relies to, the same morality that the journalist is fighting for is what the peacekeeping unit is fighting for. If the enemy is one that you want to kill, the journalist is one that you want to save.
Thank you very much. We now move to replies. Invite the first reply from opposition.
From my speech at the beginning about SAI, we gave you two main reasons as to why we must protect these individuals. Number one, that they are vulnerable, defenseless individuals in the line of war. And number two, that their function is pivotal to helping the war, helping every other individual by providing information. Which is why it's important to protect these individuals, because they are more important than babies or women, because they have more of an function in society. We also told you why the information is important. We gave you three main reasons. Number one, why people will feel safe. And if people feel safe, they won't react in a manner in emergency. And if governments need to make sure that people don't do so. Secondly, that people will cooperate and they will know what to do in a circumstance of war. If you can contain people and tell them what to do, the governments won't have much problem when it comes to war. Third reason why I told you information is important is that they won't react negatively. What will people do and what will they'll do when you tell them you killed an innocent journalist who's just there for information? No matter how much you justify to them that they went over the line by themselves, we think that people will always understand that the government allowed individuals who are innocent to die. Three questions. Number one, are journalists doing the jobs with consent? Number two, what about information? How important is it? Number three, do soldiers have the capacity? Number one, are journalists doing their jobs with consent? Because they told you, and simply they told you, that these individuals opted out of the system. That's not very simple. If you didn't have the rationale and you're forced and coerced into not opting out, because you know that if you don't and if you opt out of the system, you have no other place to go, you don't have the capacity to live, what would you do? You had no choice. Because there's one very important thing you have to understand. Because Kishan asked this question. If you're an average reasonable person, and if you know that that place is dangerous, why did you go to that place to begin with? It's not because you're profit driven, it's because you know that you had no choice but to go there to get the information for your cooperation. That's important to understand. Because if I was an average reasonable person, I wouldn't go to a war zone unless I really have to. I think it's important to recognize these people really don't have a choice in these circumstances like this. They have opposite choice. But can you really go for another job? Because it's very simply told you, hey, let's go for another job. In those circumstances, if you can really opt out and go to another job, why don't people just jump out and not opt in? Why are people still going into dangerous places? Why are people still going into line of arm? We think it's important to understand. Secondly, what about information? Because information helps people cooperate properly. If people react in a manner that is negative in times of emergencies, government needs all the cooperation and support they can get to get out of the But can information be obtained in any other manner? Because I told you they have drones and so on and so forth. We told you two very important reasons that was not responded to by side of government. Number one, governments and corporations, unlike governments, are not in turmoil where they don't have priorities to do, and the corporations can freely get information. But number two, corporations provide you information that's unbiased to one particular side. Something that was also not responded to by side of government, where corporations tell you the most important information to do so. The third question, whether or not soldiers have the capacity to do so. And this is something that was a concern from the PM. After that, somehow it died down. Because we told you that the very other day, it's the United Nations, for God's sake. If they have the ability to estimate, we think they'll send in more troops if they think that it's necessary. We think they have already done it in many countries, in Rwanda, in Liberia. We think they can do it again in these circumstances with time of turmoil. Because if there are 500 children, roughly, you need to save, and you're also going to protect journalists, you send in more combatants, it's not that hard to do so. But what about this? Do we devalue soldiers? They get the very same amount of protection that you do so. At the end of the day, side government lost this debate for multiple reasons. Number one, we told you that these individuals are no different from children, from women, from paramedics, from religious officers in the church, which is why you don't shoot them, you protect them. We already told you that these individuals are harmless, but even more, we give you a reason as to why we protect them. Because they play an important role that is not dissimilar to any other. They're the only party that can get information. They will provide cooperation between every other individual who's important to the war. We think governments don't have the capacity to do that. Even if they did, the information will never be of any quality. But lastly, we also told you that these individuals are extremely important in a circumstance where you don't have the capacity and you should never reject these individuals. That's extremely proud to propose.
Thank you very much. The final speech of this debate, we now invite the government to fly.
Journalists don't cross enemy lines because they want information or because their corporations force them to do so. They cross because they know that behind their head that they have a safeguard. They have a protection in which they feel secure. And that is the mentality that we're trying to change, and that is our end goal of today's debate. Three issues why we need today's debate. Firstly, on the idea of information. Secondly, on the idea of coercion. And lastly, on the idea of manipulation. And I'll deal with all the things that they missed out from our batch. But let's deal with the first issue, information. We think that, number one, they failed to prove to us a dire need of this information, and they failed to prove to us, or rather compare to us, why is it that the value of the information is so much more important in risking the lives of these soldiers, and yet demonizing the very idea or the very service of these soldiers itself. They failed to draw the comparison to show us why information is more important. The only justification was this: people need to know, public need to know. But where is the value behind that? Why does public need to know? Is the public, people like you and I, involved in the war? No. Why do we need to know detailed information, strategic information in which we have to go to the extent of crossing enemy lines to get those kind of information? We don't think so. All we need to know is that there are people dying, how many people are dying, how many soldiers are involved, there is a war that's happening. Those kind of information are sufficient enough for you to gain from those safe zones. We don't think that there's a dire need for you to cross enemy lines to such an extent to gain those kind of information in order for you to release to the public, because they fail to show to us why it is so dire for public to know what is happening in this sense. We think that minor informations are more than enough. But more importantly, let's look at, they also came and told us, let's look at the second issue on the idea of coercion. They came and told us that, people are poor, journalists are poor and need the job, they can't lose the job. That's a false characterization. Look at the world today. We can go for any kind of jobs that we want to. Tim studied business and now he's doing logistics. Isn't that a change of what you're doing? This is good enough proof, I think so. Because we think that even though corporations corporations coerce you, number one. We don't think that there's no opportunity for you to opt out at all. We came and talked to you about four alternatives. Number one, we told you that there's always a reason for you to resign. Number two, we told you that you can move to different fields, go and work in a cafe or whatever. Third, we came and told you that you can always move out from wanting to go into war zones. For example, you can join Net Geo, you can join a Discovery Channel, whatsoever. Any kinds of corporations that you necessarily want to go, that you can continuously pursue your occupation of a journalist. We don't think that eventually corporations can coerce you. More importantly, you can also sue corporations should they coerce you. Because their characterization was this: media corporations are evil. They want to put you into trouble, they want you to go on a suicide mission. We don't think that that's the characterization. We think that you always have a say, you always have a chance to opt out. Media corporations are not crazy people. They give you the option to opt out. More importantly, on the third idea of manipulation, this is what they told us. They said, look, if you allow the journalist to just die off and you don't do anything, eventually media is going to manipulate those kinds of facts and make the government look as someone that is bad. Firstly, that also assumes that media corporations are evil. First, characterize to me why media corporations would eventually want to do that, what kind of benefit they can gain from those kind of situations. Tell me why media corporations are evil, essentially. But secondly, they also came and told us that, eventually governments then will be lopsided, or they provide lopsided information, or they have a certain amount of restriction on what kind of information that they can leak out. So eventually the journalists will be the best one to provide those kind of information. Number one, it's an assumption to tell us that governments are like that. We don't think that governments are do necessarily have a benefit of doing so. We don't think that governments necessarily do have an incentive of doing so. They need to prove to us that incentive. We don't think that it necessarily exists in these circumstances. We don't think the governments would then manipulate information. We think that in under those three issues, we want all three issues. But let's look at what they failed to show us today. We came and talked to you about the demonization of soldiers and how you make them look like slaves to the value of life, or rather protecting people. We don't think that that's not necessarily true. Because eventually which is what my speaker came and talked to you about, eventually you bring about a slippery slope effect. Journalists will continuously want to cross enemy lines because they know that they have a safeguard in that sense. We think that this kind of mentality is what we want to change in this sense. Because corporations eventually are profit driven and they eventually want to get more information at the end of the day, which eventually risk the lives of these people. They never compared to us why the value of information is so important that we need to forego the lives of the people. Hence, we will create it. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I invite speakers across the floor and shake hands. What the fuck?